Hi, everybody. My name is Sheila Murphy, and I'm Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Research America. And I want to thank you very much for joining today's discussion, which I think is going to be incredibly interesting. And thank you all for your organization's partnership in the Research America Alliance. If you're not a member, please stay on, but please get in touch with my colleague, Ann Mandeville, and we're going to put her email in the chat. I think we all understand the challenges that people face in accessing mental health services, and that it is challenging, and particularly there is not always equal access to mental health services. So our speakers today are going to address that. As always, please put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we are able to. And our guests today are Patroski Lawson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of KPM Group DC, and Katie Landis, who is the Senior Director of Strategy and Execution at KPM Group. And Patroski and Katie are going to speak with us about the disparities in access to mental health care and the implications of those disparities. And we're really, really happy to have you both. And thank you so much.
Great. Happy to be here. Happy to be here. I'm happy to sort of kick things off, Sheila, if that's what you would, how you would.
Perfect.
And then I'll ask my colleague Katie to hop in. I think what I'd love to do is to just sort of give a little bit of background sort of on me and why this topic is so resonates with me personally. And I apologize right up front if I start to get emotional and all of that, but those who know me well know that that's just part of my, that's part of who I am. But I came to sort of the mental health arena, I would say in 2016, I had lost my job at head of government affairs for a company here in DC, or was head that had an office here in DC. And around that time, my wife started having panic attacks. And this journey began with us trying to figure out why she was having these panic attacks. And so we met with neurologists and psychiatrists, primary care physicians, and health coaches, you name it, to try to figure out what was sort of the underpinning of these panic attacks. And we soon came to the realization that after spending some time with a psychiatrist, that it was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I was bought into the diagnosis much faster, much sooner than my wife was, because she's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. She's a medical background, and there had to be a medical reason or some other reason why she was having these panic attacks. And it most certainly wasn't PTSD or something like that. And I was convinced, because I had worked at a company called Lundbeck, and who's a pharmaceutical company based out of Copenhagen, that the brain was this complex creature that everyone, in his or her lifetime is either going to have a mental health challenge or is going to be faced with some sort of brain disorder. So about 25% of the American population is dealing today, this very instant, with a mental health issue. I wouldn't call it a crisis, and it's not a crisis for everyone, but certainly for my wife, it was a crisis. So that was my first real introduction to someone who was suffering from mental health crisis. I mean, she actually thought she was going to die. And if you know anything about PTSD, that's how people feel when you have a real panic attack. You feel like you're going to die. So that was my introduction as her caregiver. And we've been on this journey for about 5 years, and I've learned a lot. And it's also led me to really focus on my brain health. I've been seeing a therapist for about 3 years after the passing of a dear friend of mine who passed away suddenly, out of the blue, unbeknownst to anyone, that he was even sick, and he passed away. And I knew it was time for me to really kind of get serious about taking care of my brain and my mental health, and the same way I care about the rest of my body. So we can talk a lot more about that. I want to introduce my colleague Katie to give a little bit of background, and then I can go into a lot more detail about sort of the topic for today. Is that okay, Sheila?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Patroski. I appreciate it. And thank you to Research America for hosting this very important conversation today. Similarly, I think as many people on the line, I have my own personal journey and experience with mental health. My brother has a severe mental illness that he lives and actually now thrives with every day, but it was a long journey to get there. Definitely lots of different experiences with the healthcare system as a gay individual, and having experienced some discrimination in that sense. And also, as he's moved around from different schools and into different jobs, his ability to access that, mental health care has shifted. And one of the reasons I'm so proud to work with KPM is that this is something that we've really leaned into heavily. And I think Patroski used the word before, brain health, but that's not something, that nomenclature isn't typical in this space. I think you'll often hear of mental health or behavioral health, but we really push forward on brain health because we see it as one brain, and the disorders look different. There are neurodegenerative disorders, there are neurodevelopmental, and there are psychiatric. But at the end of the day, it is the brain that is the, kind of the start of all of those. And the more that we can elevate mental and behavioral health as brain health writ large, I think the greater we can see some advancements in the innovation space, because it will get that same kind of spotlight. So that's kind of my opening remarks there, and a challenge to everyone to think about the word choice and how important it is in raising awareness.
Great. Thanks, Katie. So now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about sort of my experiences as an African-American person, and how all of this sort of intersects. And I think the term I'd like to use is called generational PTSD. I think that going through this journey with my wife and understanding how post-traumatic stress disorder works, it's sort of, I've come to the realization or the conclusion as an N of one, I'm no expert, but that generational PTSD is a thing, and that's for so many people of color, particularly Black and brown people, but primarily for Black Americans in this country, slavery still exacts a heavy toll, or what happened during that period of time exacted a heavy toll on a whole generation of my ancestors. And then you layer on top of that Jim Crow. So once slavery ended, there was a time in this country where people of color, primarily African Americans, were discriminated against through legislation and through local ordinances and laws by people. It was actually, Jim Crow was a thing. And so, and then fast forward to, the 60s with segregation and schools and stuff. All of that has exacted an incredible toll on a whole generation or multiple generations of people, to the point where it's almost impossible to not have a conversation about, it's like, why is it always, every time I turn around African Americans, they always want to talk about race, and they want to talk about reparations, and they want to talk about, how the deck has been stacked against them, and how the playing field isn't level, and the system is rigged, which is actually rigged against people of color, not against former presidents. But let's talk about that later. So, and it just hit me, PTSD, that the trauma was real from those experiences, and people have not been able to heal properly. First of all, you have to identify that there's a problem, right? If you are having a mental health challenge. It took a long time for my wife to come to grips with the fact that PTSD was a real diagnosis, and that this was something that was actually causing her panic attacks. That this was something in the brain that trauma can cause that. And then I read the statistic that 93% of women, didn't read it. I heard it in a talk that 93% of women who are incarcerated in prison are victims of sexual violence. Now, sexual violence, that's trauma. That's traumatic. And so just putting all of these pieces together, I think it's one of the reasons why people of color, particularly African Americans, one, they haven't healed, still dealing with a lot of generational PTSD. And that's part of it. And then the second part of it is that because of the deep mistrust of the system, like probably some of it is warranted, the system is, they feel that the system is stacked against them, so they won't seek out treatment. It's why so many, with vaccinations, the vaccination rates early on were lower in communities of color. When you think about what happened in Tennessee, in the Tuskegee syphilis trials, and you think about all of the experiments that were done on African Americans over the years, it's no wonder that people are mistrustful and are not eager to seek out healthcare, because they think that they're not going to trust the person on the other end, the doctor, the nurse or the medical provider on the other end, to give them, to be honest and truthful to them, and to act in their best interests. So that's just sort of some of the historical aspects that I've only come to sort of unpack as I've sort of gotten more into this. And then the last part that I want to address is my mom. And everything's personal with me. And my wife would tell you if she were here, is like, okay, Patroski wears his heart on his sleeve. You know exactly what's going on with him all the time. And sometimes that's not a good thing. So, but in this instance, all of this became clear to me after dealing with my mom's situation. So my mom is a Christian Science monitor believer, believes in Christian Science. And I think she found Christian Science because it supported her beliefs that, the mind is, you don't need access to care. You don't need to see doctors. You don't need to that the medical profession is something that is not something that you need to worry about. And I think a lot of that is born out of her mistrust and the mistrust of people of her generation for the healthcare system. So she had a psychiatric episode, psychotic episode, psychosis is the term, and it's been a year's journey that we've been on with her to try to get her adequate medical care and adequate psychiatric evaluations, neurological evaluations, and she has not been a partner in this journey. And a lot of it is not just a Christian Science aspect of it, which is real, but it's the mistrust of the system. So what's all I'd have to do with this topic? And I'll come to that after I turn it back over to Katie. But I think the point is mistrust by people, Black and brown people, is one of the biggest issues that we as a society have to grapple with if we're going to sort of level the playing field, or to get people in these communities to understand that the brain is a part of the body and it needs to be nurtured and cared for much the same way. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Katie.
Patroski. I think just, we've talked a lot about some of the issues that we see, or our own experiences with the system. But one thing I'd love to kind of touch on is some of the solutions and the exciting things that we're seeing coming out of the administration and off of Capitol Hill that give us, and, from different stakeholders in the system, that give us some hope and that there's a light at the end of this tunnel, because there's been a lot of red flags raised that our country's in the midst of a mental health crisis and an opioid epidemic that are worsening. But what we're seeing is that kind of attention shift to action. So a few areas I'd love to highlight are parity, workforce, and then innovation. So on the parity front, I think this is an area where we really see some of what Patroski said come to life. And in particular with lower socioeconomic groups, their ability to access mental health care at different points in the system, just to access healthcare in general, is already diminished, but especially mental health care. And one thing we see is the parity charge that was put forward by Congress in 2008 is still not realized in the Medicaid community. Those requirements are only for private payers and not for government payers. And this is a significant challenge because for lower socioeconomic groups, the way that they are able to access healthcare is through Medicaid. And unfortunately, those parity requirements are not enforced in Medicaid. So that's one challenge that we have, but also a potential area for solution. And we see that with Medicaid and Medicare. And then another encouraging thing is around telehealth. And just today with some legislation that we're seeing, there's some telehealth components. And this is an area where there's both hope, but also would like to be cautious, because if you do not have the ability to access the internet or to access the right kind of devices to use the internet, then telehealth isn't realized as really breaking down those barriers to healthcare. If you have the ability to access those things, then it can be a really great tool, but we need to think about that baseline accessing, broadband internet and things like that. And then, on the workforce front, we have the pleasure with working with a group called NBCC, the National Board for Certified Counselors. And it's another group that is offering healthcare and at the provider level. And I think we need to think about different providers that can help fill the gap, because there is a significant workforce challenge. And if you don't have the ability to speak with someone or to access that healthcare, then you really can't confront the challenge that you're facing. So right now, our provider community is definitely experiencing an overload. And if we can think about different and creative ways to ensure that there are different stakeholders and that they're reimbursed properly and that they're brought into the system as well to provide that culturally competent care, I think that's another potential solution. And then just on the front of culturally competent care, I know that's a buzzword that's thrown around a lot. And Patroski, I think your experience speaks to what does that mean for someone like your mom? What does culturally competent care mean to drive better health outcomes for her, right? You need to really think about the person and the individual and what makes sense for them. And I think we're seeing a lot of great things come out of SAMHSA with its minority fellowship program, and really, addressing that at the training level with the provider community so that they are able to better assess the needs of the people that they're serving ultimately. And the final front that I'd like to discuss is the innovation front, which I think there really is a lot of exciting work being done in this space. I think over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen a lot of stagnancy in terms of mental health care and different innovations and all of that. There's a shifting tide right now when it comes to different treatments, because I think there's a recognition that you need as many tools in the toolbox to address this mental health crisis that we find ourselves in, and especially for marginalized communities, the ability to access that innovation is going to be really key. What we've seen in the past is that the innovation might move forward, but people of color are not always able to access it. So it's something we have to keep in mind. And that starts at the clinical trial phase with how do we design trials to make sure that they're inclusive of the population that's going to receive those kind of treatments.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. And I know I can talk about this for a long time. We're getting some really good questions in the chat box, but I kind of wanted to sort of round this out with another piece to this when it comes to communities of color, particularly African Americans, to sort of give you some context. And that's the church, the Black church. Okay. And if you think about slavery and you think about all of these problems that particularly African Americans, I'm going to speak for African Americans community. My family is very religious. Oh my God, you can't, they're quoting Bible scriptures left and right and sideways. But there's this view that God will take care of everything, or that Jesus, to just trust in Jesus and in Jesus' name and all of that. That's it. But I think what we're starting to recognize, at least in the work that I do, and I'm sure a lot of you do, is that it's more, it takes more than that, right? It takes more than your faith alone. Without works is just not going to get it done. So having options or tools in the toolbox, providing people with tools that they can use to take their mental health or their brain health seriously is really the only way. It's not a one size fits all approach. And so I would like to see more happening in Black churches and synagogues and houses of worship to really address brain health head on, in the way that I think a lot of churches, at least in the South, African American churches, are doing health fairs. I don't know if they're doing mental health screenings or behavioral health screenings or brain health screenings or what have you, but these are realistic steps that people can take to start to normalize the behavior of okay, I'm going to do my my physical once a year, my physical exam once a year. I'm going to do a brain health checkup that's separate from that. If I can afford. I realize resources is not the same for everyone, but just socializing the idea that both are important, I think is a good place to start. And I wanted to mention that one because it's very difficult for people of my mom's age and her friends to acknowledge that something is wrong, because for so long they've had to, like, everything's great, everything's fine. And when we all know that that's not realistic. Every day is not sunny side up, but you're allowed to have bad days. You're allowed to not feel great every single day. There's no harm, no foul in that. But allowing yourself to be vulnerable is tricky when you are of a generation where, you got to be strong. You have to show no weakness. And I think that the Black church can be helpful in that endeavor. I also think sororities and fraternities and other organizations can be very helpful in this way, because they're trusted. They're already trusted in ways that, say, government isn't for communities of color. So I'll sort of pause there and say that the point that I would like to make is that trauma is real, right? PTSD and others. The 22 veterans are killing them, are dying by their own hands every single day because of PTSD. Well, wow, that's serious, and we need to take it seriously more so than we are now. And I think we need to take the time to talk about it in a way that is that sort of normalizes it, like a broken foot or and I realize it's different because this is the brain, but I'm telling you, I think that should be a part of the solution for improvement. So I'll pause there because I could keep going, but I think
Okay.
we want to have time for questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, both of you. This is incredibly helpful. I'm going to kick it off with a question. I think that you had some good suggestions about addressing the mistrust in the African American community of medical providers, and it's churches and sororities and fraternities and all of that. Are there other ways to kind of address this mistrust? And it's a huge issue in the African American community, and it's also a huge issue with vaccines and things like that. So it's something. I mean, the mistrust, I think, might be driven by different things, but we still have to address them. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. It's the mistrust is case in point. My mom, she's seen all of these healthcare providers, but the only person that she will listen to, even over me, is an African American female doctor. That's it. And I said, what is that? And the doctor broke it down to me. He's like, well, no, I look like her. I'm speaking the same language as her. I mean, we have the same, and my mom's in her mid 70s, but that was the trust, right? I mean, it's like the inherent trust that African American doctor had with, or that my mom felt was real and palpable. So how do we get more, the easy solutions? How do we get more Black and brown people in medicine? Most of the doctors and healthcare providers that are trained are coming out of HBCUs, and they're not coming out of these traditional, medical schools. Are coming out of Howard and places like that. So I think to get to your question about mistrust, there is no silver bullet. There's no magic bullet. I think it really happens at the local level. There was one person, I think it was Jasmine, that asked a question or made the comment about community groups. A lot of it's locally based community groups. It's forming transformational relationships, not transactional relationships. And for those of you who think that buying a table at a gala is the way to build a relationship with an African American or any group, that's a fool's errand. That is not going to get it done. So you got to do a lot more than buying tables at galas and things like that. Or even doing community walks. That's the cost of doing business. If you want to build transactional relationships, you need to be there when the chips are down. You need to show up when people don't expect you to be there. And so, but that takes time. There's no shortcut, and it's just going to take time. It's rolling up your sleeves, getting into these communities and building trust the old fashioned way, one day at a time, one person at a time.
Right. Thank you.
Katie?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Patroski said, it's something we talk a lot about at our firm, but it's action over words. There's been a lot said, and I think, even now we're saying a lot, but it's really about, can we do something with what we're saying? There's a lot, there's a huge spotlight on this issue right now, a lot of health equity efforts at different levels, especially being driven at the federal level. But what it comes down to is the boots on the ground who understand the situation the best. They have the most awareness, and they have probably the best solutions, and they just need a platform to share them and to bring people together. And the only way to do that is through the transformational relationships Patroski spoke to.
Amen.
Both. I am going to let Sam take over the questions. Are we ready to do that, Sam? You're on mute.
Hi, everyone. Thank you both so much for your comments. This has been an amazing conversation so far. So we do have a question in our Q&A box. This person is asking, how does prior authorization and similar insurance imposed barriers to care impact that trust that we're speaking to, and impact access to care among people of color in the Black community in specific?
Katie, you want to start with that one?
Sure. I think that one thing when you think about prior authorization is, if you're doing all this work to build up the relationship and the trust between a patient and their provider, prior authorization then serves to break down that trust in some ways, because the provider has made a medical decision based on what they believe is best in conversations with their patients, and prior authorization can just serve as a barrier to the patient accessing that care. So all the work that they may have done to come to that decision together in some ways can be cut down by some of these barriers that we see with prior auth or step therapies, where it's it's not necessarily honoring that patient provider relationship.
Yeah, and it's just viewed by, just channeling. This is me being empathetic. I'm in a pretty good place, got private insurance and all, but it's like, okay, it's just another tool used to deny me access. And it's like, okay, it's just something, it's just another tool in the toolbox for those with, to hurt people like me who are without. That's how the average, not the average, but consumer of healthcare, that's how they view it. It's like,
Yes, I get it.
Definitely. So are there any examples that you can share with us of some progress that we've seen? We're talking a lot about the disparities, but any thoughts on progress and how we can reach progress?
I would like to say that if you're starting to see, I think, okay, let's talk about progress. Everybody and their brother is talking about brain health and mental health, in the age of COVID, how it's impacting children, how it's impacting, young adults, how it's impacting every community in the world. So that's a good thing, right? Conversation, is happening in a different way, in a meaningful way. But it's like, and Katie knows where I'm headed. Just because you put up your Black Lives Matter sign in your window, or your fact that you are, pride and you're all of this, doesn't mean anything. It's like, it's just noise from my perspective. It's good to talk about. I'm glad we're amplifying and raising the issue, but I want to see action. I want to see steps that, people are actually taking to improve the issue. So for example, at KPM, what do? You say, okay, mental health is important for you and your family. And if someone in our company is, needs a mental health day or needs a day, we should all have those. We try to be very empathetic and understanding and say, hey, I get it, because a sick day, a mental health day, or a brain health day, in my view, that's it's a sick day. If you have, you know what I'm saying, it should be treated like, oh, this isn't something that's unusual or strange. It should be just a part of normalizing the behavior that we care about people's mental health and their brain health. So at KPM, if someone needs to take some time off, they get to take that time off, and that starts from the top. And I think small step, very small step, but it's action that I want to see. And I do think you're starting to see a move towards action in a lot of ways. I do think that some churches are starting to talk about the intersection between brain health and mental health and brain health and well-being. In the rare disease community, it's interesting. I know that there's some folks here from the rare disease community. I was at a sickle cell event, dinner hosted in Boston, and I found out that the number one issue confronting that patient community is brain health. Like, what? It's like, yeah. I mean, it's a really huge issue. So people are starting to get comfortable talking about it, and I think that taking the time to talk about it is a step towards progress. That is because, you know, you have to acknowledge that there's a problem or that there's an issue before you can look for solutions. Whereas before, you know, final point I'll make. I just said my son sees a child psychologist, and she said to me that his child psychologist said that most of her patients are boys. Boys are not taught at that age how to social emotional intelligence is not a thing for boys. It's not a thing for men, right? Being affectionate, being sensitive, those are not male in this society. Those are not things you're supposed to show. So my point is, and her point was, that we're starting to see society, people move towards recognizing that we need to take care of our young boys, black, white, blue, red, or indifferent, because it's not okay for them to grow up thinking that they are emotionless people. So
yeah, just to add to that, I think what excites me the most is innovation and research. There's a lot of great work being done by, you know, public and private stakeholders. The NIH has the Brain Initiative, which is, you know, I'm sure you have all covered it in the past and many people may be familiar with it, but it's really exciting to, you know, the possibility of being able to truly understand the brain and all of the different pathways and how they interact with each other. And that's something that we're seeing come out of the government. And there's a lot of different stakeholders involved in that. I think from some advocacy organizations, we have the pleasure of working with quite a few of them, and the work that they're doing to, I think, you know, Patroski's point, elevate the conversation. That is the first step, because we're acknowledging that there is something wrong, but you need to engage with different stakeholders to understand how they see the issue, because, you know, everyone's going to identify it a little bit differently, and what might make sense for one community to address is going to look different for a different community. And then finally, you know, private stakeholders. We work with a lot of great innovative biotech companies that are focused on mental health, you know, and brain health writ large, but focus on making products that are innovative and help reduce some of the burdens that, you know, patients might currently experience with their mental health treatments. And so it looks different. You know, there's part of it that's just accessing, you know, different providers. And then there's a part of it that are accessing different treatments. And we're seeing a lot of great work being done in that space. And I think a lot of great work being done in public-private partnerships as well.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Excellent. So we have another question from the chat. Could you please elaborate on how college students may be more included in equity in mental health care? Furthermore, what role do public universities play in helping their students develop mental health programs?
So I will take the first go at this one. I'm actually a former college student athlete. And I think, you know, right now there's been a lot in the news about recent suicides among student athletes. So this is something I feel pretty personally connected to. You know, sometimes schools put in place school psychologists or have, you know, counseling offices, but I do think that there's a lot more work that can be done to elevate those on campus. Often it's only once you hit a crisis situation that you're introduced to those services. And I think that there's an opportunity earlier on to have those introductions. And then speaking from my own brother's experience, he is now at a state school in New York and has been able to actually finally have a consistent regimen with a psychiatrist and a psychologist, which in the past it's been one or the other. So it's been kind of disjointed care for him, and hasn't always been able to access those services. So I do think that public universities do play that role, and they already provide healthcare for a lot of students. And one component of that is providing that mental health care. The issue comes down to the number of providers that are available, because you can imagine that they quickly would be overwhelmed. So we do have to think about innovative ways to get others into the system, and to think about peer-to-peer opportunities. There's, sometimes at that age in college, you might relate more to a peer around some of the similar issues that you're experiencing. So can we train up some college students to help fill the gap in some ways when they aren't yet at that crisis point? I don't know,
Yeah.
Patroski, if you have anything to add.
You said that beautifully. I don't have anything to add. I think it starts from the top of the administration, as someone who runs a small business. Like, I feel like leadership that has to come from the top. And so absolutely, colleges and universities have an obligation to lean in to providing all the students that are in their academic charge, the ability to be as successful as they possibly can across the board. So I agree with everything you said, Katie.
Great. Do we have time for one more question, Sam?
I think so. So how would you compare the US approach to mental health care to the global context? Are there lessons to be learned, or anything that we should be paying attention to?
Wow, that's a great question. It does seem like this is anecdotally, because I haven't worked in Europe for quite some time, but it seems like, at least on the psychedelics front, Katie, you probably know where I'm going here, that there's a little bit more willingness to accept sort of other more options, treatment options for people. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, being open. I mean, we're tend to be somewhat restrictive here in the US when it comes to policies around, controlled substances and whatnot. And I think in Europe, at least, the culture is like, whatever works. Should that seems to be more of a philosophy there. But here it's not. Well, it's not so much whatever works. It's like whatever works, that's legal or something. Maybe I'm not stating that correctly. So, but other than that, I have to be brutally honest. I don't have a lot of line of sight into what's happening ex-US when it comes to mental health policy. Although I knew that the World Health Organization just put out their mental health paper, I think just this past week. So, Katie, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I think, you hit the nail on the head with the psychedelics. I will say that there's a lot more restrictions with scheduling and things like that. And we are seeing some encouraging studies that are both private and public stakeholders running studies using these psychedelic substances to see if there's potential there. And I think it was something that was promising research back in 1960s that we're starting to pick up again. And we've seen some great results from work with veterans communities as well. I would say it all comes back to culturally competent care. There, if we just make the US EU comparison, there's a lot of societal similarities that we can speak to in terms of raising awareness and just the ability to talk about mental health more openly. But others, cultures don't have that kind of openness towards these conversations. So I think there's probably more work just on the awareness and acceptance that these are a reality of everyday life that can be done ex-US. And then, the final thing I think is just about willingness or ability to access services looks different for different communities in the EU and in the US. And I find that there's probably some things that we can learn about making sure that there's different access points for individuals.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be respectful of our speakers' time and our participants' time, and just wondered if either of you had any final remarks that you wanted to give. If not, we can just thank you so much for doing this.
I do. I want to sort of issue a challenge to everyone. Three thoughts for you, for those of us on the call. One is, obviously, if you don't see a primary care physician annually, you need to do that, because in most parts of the country where healthcare is inconsistent and incongruent, the primary care physician, the family doctor, is the person who is your first line of sight into your brain health. And so with my mom, she has been mission critical as an advisory board member for me to help my mom. So that's very, very important. The second is, take the time to talk about how you're feeling, and be honest and open with yourself and with others around you. It's okay, like I said, to not have a good day or not have a bad, every day is not, rainbows and sunshine, and that's okay. And being open and honest and transparent about that with yourself first is step one. But then it's okay to let people around you know how you're feeling and how you're doing. That's a sign of strength, not weakness. So that's the second point. And then I would say, well, actually, that's it. Those were my two. And just, those were my two, because I wrapped the third one up into the second one. But it's very, very important. So thank you very much. Katie.
Yeah, just wanted to thank everyone for their time. And one thing I will give a similar charge is, there's a lot of great work that's done with groups like American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, or NAMI, or the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, Mental Health America, at the local level. So think about getting involved in those organizations if you're really invested in learning more and hearing other people's shared experiences. I've personally been involved with American Foundation for Suicide Prevention at the local level in New York, and it's great to have a community, and it's great to feel that there's a shared mission that people are driving towards. And then to Patroski's point, it's these opportunities to speak about things openly and candidly, and Research America to, kudos to you for giving this a forum, because that's half of the battle that we're still experiencing.
I completely agree. And I want to thank you both so much for speaking to us today. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your own personal stories, because I think a lot of times that really helps people, sort of understand the best path forward if they realize that they're not the only one dealing with these issues. So anyway, yes, exactly. So thank you. Really, really appreciate it. And look forward to continuing the conversation at some point.
That's good. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.